Hook and Sparkshy stood under the cold glow of the departure screens, while the supervisor crushed her boarding pass in one careless fist, and the sound of forced laughter rolled across the first-class lounge like breaking glass, and the word fraud flowed from a staff mic by mistake or by design, traveling through the speakers so everyone could hear and pretend they had not heard. Her fingers did not shake because she would not give them that, and her jaw locked in a stillness that had weight, and history in ache, and the red denied stamp bled across the paper like a wound, and the crowd did its usual dance of polite invisibility, phones raised to faces, earbuds in, eyes away, hearts silent, a choreography of safe distance that left her standing alone with the heat of 100 stares and the cold of 0 voices beside her. The staff trio at the counter leaned close, as if conferring, yet their words traveled easily across polished floors and glass walls. One commented on her name, as if it were a costume. One remarked on her accent, as if it were a stain. One tugged at the sleeve of his blazer and said, "Some people forget where they belong and they're clipped." Grins flashed like warning lights that never turned into help. She did not plead, she did not explain, she did not tell them this flight was to close a deal the airline had begged for, across 4 anxious quarters and 7 emergency board meetings. She did not tell them about the blue folder in her tote titled Meridian Charter Agreement, or the way numbers inside that folder could lift a company or hollow it out. And she did not tell them that the signature required to seal or break that future was hers and hers alone, because truth carried more force when timed. Like thunder, and hers was already gathering. She lifted the boarding pass and felt the pulp of ruined paper against her palm like a small heart slowing, and she breathed once and said quietly, "Return my passport," and the supervisor tilted her head with a smile that did not reach her eyes and slid the passport back, as if delivering a kindness, and the lounge resumed its hum, as if a storm had walked through and decided to sit down outside the glass partition. She stepped aside from the flow of travelers and pressed call on a number saved without a name and a voice answered with urgency, saying, "The board is waiting, and the lawyers are in the room, and the other airline has joined by video, and we need your signal now." And she said, "Hold." And then she looked through the glass at the counter, where laughter still hung in the air like smoke that could choke a whole building given the smallest spark. She opened the blue folder, not to read but to touch the pages and remember the months of travel, the nights of numbers, the mornings of promises, the weight of belief she carried that fair work could bend outcomes, and she realized belief alone never moves a single gate when those who guard the hinges prefer them rusted shut, and she chose in that breath to move the whole door. Instead she called a second number, and a deep voice responded with respect already woven into it, saying, "Ma'am, say the word." And she said, "Begin the withdrawal and send the clause that cites breach of dignity." And the deep voice repeated the words like an oath, and asked, "Do you wish a cooling period?" And she said no, then yes, then no again, and finally said, "Send the courtesy window of 6 minutes, and let them see the clock tick in their own inbox." And the voice said understood, and hung up with the calm of a person who has watched many storms begin and end. The doors to the lounge slid open with a hush, and a tall man in a navy suit stepped in, moving with the contained force of a person used to dark rooms and bright outcomes, and he carried no uniform and no badge and no smile, and yet people made space the way rivers move for stones that change their path, and he saw her at once and changed direction with purpose. He stopped a little distance from her and spoke in a tone that did not ask for trust and did not offer apology. He said, "Ms. Adayami, I am here on behalf of executive operations, and I need 2 minutes." And she looked at him with eyes that held grief and fire, and she said, "You have won." And he glanced at the counter where the staff had resumed their quiet talk, and their eyes that said nothing and everything. And he said, "There is more at stake here than a delay, and more at stake than a single gate." And she said, "There is always more at stake when power needs the people it steps on." And he absorbed that like a rain. He knew he deserved to stand. Ina shift went through the lounge like a shiver, leaving and entering at the same time as phones began to buzz on the belts of managers and the counters of supervisors, alert chimes cascading a new rhythm through the air. And a woman in a blazer took a call and went still, and another opened her email and closed it again as if the light had burned her, and the laughter ended as cleanly as if a switch had been pulled from the wall. The tall man said, "Give me the courtesy window, and we'll make this right." And she said the window already opened, and the window already closed, and he asked without asking who signed the withdrawal, and she said I did, and he absorbed that too, and lowered his voice further and said there is a board member on site, and if you meet him he will make a public apology right now. And she said the apology is not a purchase, and the purchase is not an apology. And the man nodded, as if she had placed a measure on the table that he could not move with words. She stepped back to the glass and watched the staff, who had mocked her, shift their weight and straighten their jackets and smooth their hair, as managers gathered behind the counter like a tide coming in, with apologies tucked in their pockets, waiting to be folded into safe shapes and handed over as if sincerity could be ironed into fabric and handed out like napkins. And she felt a grief older than this airport move through her, a grief that remembered 1,000 small rooms where no one spoke up and 1,000 neat smiles that sealed injury in silence. And she knew revenge would never stitch the whole wound, yet it could stop the bleeding that kept getting called normal. Her phone rang again, the first voice saying the board is asking if they can still meet you in New York. And she said hold, and then turned to the tall man and said, tell your board member to meet me here in the open, not in a back office and not in a quiet lounge. And he said, give me 1 minute, and he walked away with the gait of someone who understands that minutes can be heavy enough to break a floor. She looked at the clock above the gate and felt the 6-minute window thinning like winter light, and she picked up her tote and slid the blue folder inside, and there was a small child standing with her mother near the glass, watching her openly with the honest study of a young mind. And the child said softly, I like your braids, and in that thread-thin sentence the entire day shifted by a fraction of a degree. And she bent at the waist so her eyes were level with the child and said thank you. And for a second she wanted to cry, not from pain but from the sudden reminder that softness exists even where cruelty does its best to crowd it out. A ripple passed down the corridor as 2 executives approached in a hurry, one with a tie slightly askew and one with a face set in careful resolve, and behind them the tall man matched their pace, and together they looked like a solution trying to catch up with a consequence. And the executive with the tie stepped forward and said, Ms. Adeyemi, I am responsible for what happens under this brand, and I am sorry for what happened to you. And she raised one hand, and the man stopped because her gesture was not a demand for silence, but a measure of sincerity. And she said, I will not accept words that cost nothing in places where harm costs everything. And the executive swallowed and nodded, and then turned to the staff at the counter and said, bring the supervisor and the 2 agents who are on duty, and bring them now, and make space for the passengers to hear, because we will not hide this in a hallway. The staff came forward with faces that had learned to arrange themselves into innocence and confusion, and the supervisor held her own calm like a shield and said there must be a misunderstanding. And the executive said, we can either perform a misunderstanding or we can face a truth. And the supervisor glanced at her team and at the gathered phones and at the passengers, who had suddenly remembered their voices, and she chose performance because it had always worked. And she said, we did not say anything inappropriate, and we followed procedure, and we only denied boarding because of a system flag. And the executive said the system flag now shows as cleared, and the denial stamp on the boarding pass matches your login. And the supervisor said, then the system is inconsistent. And the tall man stepped in and said the lounge audio log exists, and it can play through the speakers right now. And a slow hush moved like a curtain across the room. Phone vibrated with a new message, and she glanced down and saw the document that confirmed the withdrawal was complete, and that the courtesy window had closed, and that the company was free, but also visibly bleeding. And the weight of that decision settled in her bones with a mix of relief and sorrow that follows any act that protects dignity by cutting through profit. And she felt the ache of everything she had carried to reach this hour, and she let herself stand tall in it. The executive looked at her again and said, give me the chance to repair what can be repaired. And she said, repair in public and protect the staff who tried nothing, and speak to the child who will grow up watching how apology is shaped, and make sure the apology does not hide the harm inside it like a needle tucked in a cushion. And the executive nodded and turned toward the speakers and raised his hand, and the audio log clicked alive, and a familiar chorus poured back into the room, the mocking about her name, the sneer at her accent, the laugh about where she belongs. And the room reacted with a sound that was neither gasp nor shout, but something older, a collective refusal to keep pretending this is normal. And the supervisor paled, and the agent stared at the floor, and the executive closed his eyes for one long breath and then opened them again like a person who has decided to stop blinking while the truth stands in front of him. She stepped beside the child and the mother and let the audio finish. its ugly loop, and then the tall man whispered the other airline sent a message. They have seen the news, and they will extend their offer. And she said, send them a reply that we will meet, and we will ask for more than planes. We will ask for a code of dignity signed by every partner. And he nodded because leverage made sense to him, and dignity sounded like a new kind of asset that could change a ledger in ways numbers alone never had. The executive faced the gathering and said, the contract we needed to survive has been withdrawn, and the reason is what you just heard and what you just witnessed, and we will accept the loss because our values are worth nothing if they only live in our press releases. And the room was quiet the way a sea becomes quiet before a wave lifts into something large enough to carry or drown. And he turned to her and said, if you allow it, I will ask you for guidance on how to begin again since you hold the power we failed to respect. And she studied him for a heartbeat that felt like a lifetime, and then her phone lit with a name she had not seen in years, the name of the one person who could make or break everything in a different way. And the call pulsed like a flare across dark water. She answered without moving from the child's side, and the voice on the line said, I know who told them to target you. And the voice was steady and low and old with knowledge. And as she listened, the color shifted in the room like the sky before lightning, because the name that followed carried a history she had buried and a betrayal she had not yet uncovered. And the tall man saw the change in her eyes and stepped closer, as if proximity could soften whatever truth had just reached her. The line went quiet, the crowd held its breath, the apology hovered unfinished, and the clock over the gate hummed in indifferent light, while she looked up from the phone and said one sentence that turned the floor to ice and the ceiling to thunder, and sent every manager scrambling in a new direction. I know who set this in motion, and it was not the staff you can see now. It was the person behind your biggest deal, and I will prove it next. The web of betrayal unfolds. The phone in her hand was warm and heavy, like it carried not only a voice but the pulse of everything hidden. The voice on the other end spoke slowly, each word deliberate like a hammer striking nails into a coffin. The man said, you were not mocked by accident. They were instructed to humiliate you and to deny your boarding because someone higher up wanted to break you publicly and ensure you lost your authority in the negotiation. The deal was never meant to succeed. They wanted you humiliated before you could close. If her body stilled like stone, her breath shallow. The crowd in the lounge still murmuring, the executives still pretending they had control, the supervisor and staff still sweating beneath the knowledge of their recorded cruelty. Yet now her attention shifted inward, where the truth had sunk. It's Hook, she asked quietly. Who gave the order? And the man said a name that chilled her spine. A name from her past, someone who had once held her hand in victory and whispered promises of partnership, someone she had trusted and then lost to greed and ambition. Someone who had learned her strengths and turned them into weapons against her. The voice said it was Marcus Hale. Her fingers tightened around the phone as memory surged. Marcus Hale, once her closest ally in the world of contracts and mergers. They had built companies side by side, chased investors, together survived storms that had drowned others. He had been like a brother, until the day he disappeared with investors' funds, leaving her to face the fallout alone. She had survived, rebuilt from ashes, but now here he was again, moving from shadows to orchestrate her humiliation. He wanted her reputation broken because her victory threatened his empire. She lowered the phone and her face was unreadable, but inside fury and grief churned together. A storm that made her chest burn. The tall man in the navy suit noticed the shift in her aura, the steel in her posture. He stepped closer and said, who was it? She looked him dead in the eyes and whispered the name Marcus Hale, and he inhaled sharp and low, because even he knew that name. The executives glanced at each other confused, because Marcus Hale was not just an enemy of hers, he was a quiet shareholder in their airline, one of the men who had pushed hardest for the deal, one of the men who smiled in public meetings while pulling strings in secret. The realization that they were caught between her wrath and his influence spread across their faces like cracks in glass. Passengers began pulling out phones, not to record mockery, but to capture the drama unfolding here. This was no longer just a customer denied a seat. This was a war between power brokers, happening in real time in an airport lounge, and the world outside would know. She raised her chin and spoke loudly enough for the lounge to hear. She said, the contract is dead, not because of a mistake, not because of incompetence, but because betrayal sits at the very table that begged for it. And when she said betrayal, the word echoed like a bell through the room. The executive with the tie loosened it. His skin pale. He said, Ms. Adayami, we did not know, we swear it. And she said, ignorance is no defense when loyalty to betrayal is paid with silence. And he looked at the floor, because truth had cornered him there. Tall man touched his earpiece and stepped aside, listening to a report, then returned with a grim expression. He said, "Marcus, Hallie is here in this terminal right now. Security says he landed 2 hours ago and has been waiting in the VIP lounge. He is not hiding, he is watching," and she felt her skin prickle with the weight of being observed. Her phone rang again, a different number flashing, this time private. She answered without hesitation. The voice, smooth and taunting, slid into her ear. Marcus himself, speaking as if he had been waiting for this moment. He said, "You are always so dramatic, Amara, but you should know better than to fight me here in public, because I have friends in higher places than you can imagine." She walked slowly across the lounge while passengers tracked her like she was gravity itself. She said, "Marcus, you never changed, still playing with lives, still chasing power by burning people who once trusted you." And Marcus laughed, low and cruel. He said, "Trust is the currency of fools, and revenge is the only profit that never devalues." And she asked, "So humiliating me was your plan to stop the deal?" And he said, "No, humiliating you was step 1. The deal dying was step 2. The real endgame comes when your name is ash and your influence is erased." The tall man leaned close. As she ended the call, he whispered, "We can have him arrested." And she shook her head. "No," she said, "not yet. Revenge must be sculpted, not rushed. If you cut marble too fast, it shatters, but if you carve carefully, it lasts forever." She tucked her phone away, and her eyes glimmered with something the tall man had not seen before. Not rage, not grief, but precision. "The executives scrambled to salvage control," one said. "Ms. Adayemi, perhaps we can offer restitution. Perhaps we can reopen negotiations with your firm." And she cut him with a look and said, "You cannot buy back dignity with scraps." From the same table that served betrayal, the passengers began clapping softly, not because they understood every detail, but because they recognized courage when they saw it, and because in that moment she stood taller than the men who claimed power around her. The tall man led her out of the lounge and into a quieter corridor. His voice steady, he said, "I need to know how far you intend to take this, because if Marcus Hale is behind this, then he has more than just this airline in his grip." And she said, "Then I will not stop at this airline. I will pull his grip finger by finger until he learns what it means to be powerless." They walked past glass walls, where nightlights of the runway shimmered, planes moving like ghosts against the horizon. She said, "I have proof of his fraud from years ago, documents he thought destroyed, but I kept copies. He thought I was broken when he left me with nothing, but I kept evidence as my only wealth, and now it will be the hammer." The tall man nodded slowly, seeing the shape of a plan unfolding, and said, "Then use me. I am not here by chance. I was placed to ensure the contract closed, but if the contract is gone, my loyalty shifts to the person who carries the truth." Back in the lounge, chaos swelled, managers scrambling to explain, passengers demanding answers, news already leaking online, the airline brand bleeding in real time. Her phone buzzed again, this time a message from an unknown sender, but the words froze her. It said, "They know where your sister is." She stopped mid-step, her breath sharp. Her sister, the only family she had left, the one she had been protecting quietly for years, keeping her out of public life because Marcus had once threatened her, has leveraged. The text glowed like fire in her hand, and the tall man saw her reaction. He asked, "What is it?" And she whispered, "My sister." The corridors around them blurred into noise and shadow. She read the message again. It continued, "If you move against Marcus, she disappears. Stay silent, and she lives. The choice is yours." Her body felt like ice, rage and fear clashing inside her. She whispered, "Marcus has her." And the tall man shook his head and said, "Not yet. This is a threat designed to cage you. But if it is true, we can find her before he does." Her hand trembled, but her voice hardened. She said, "Then we fight on 2 fronts. We fight for the truth, and we fight for her, because I will not lose the last piece of my heart." Till him, the tall man nodded once, and his tone was iron. "Then we begin now." The night outside, the windows stretched wide, and heavy planes rose like arrows into the darkness. But in her chest, another kind of flight was beginning, a war not only against humiliation, not only against betrayal, but against a man who had once been her closest ally and was now her greatest enemy. And as the clock struck midnight in the terminal, Amara Adayemi swore to herself that Marcus Hale would learn what it means when a woman mocked, betrayed and cornered rises not to beg but to distribute. Their next call would set everything in motion. The next choice would decide whether survival was enough or whether revenge would become legend. The counterstrike begins. The Airport was quieter now, though the echoes of chaos still rippled through its polished corridors, and the glowing screens still carried delays that passengers did not understand, and security teams moved with urgency because whispers of Marcus Hale had reached ears that normally never flinched. Yet in one corner of the terminal, Amara Adayemi stood with the tall man beside her, her phone clutched tightly and her mind racing through the message about her sister. The tall man, whose name she finally asked and learned was Daniel, spoke low and calm as if calmness could anchor her. He said threats are weapons Marcus uses when he thinks he has the upper hand, but power is never absolute, it only feels that way when fear agrees to wear chains. You must not agree to wear them now. Mara's throat burned with both fear and fire. She said, "If he touches my sister, there will be nothing left of him." And Daniel replied, "Then we must ensure he never has the chance. We need to move her. We need to find out where she is." At this very moment, they moved into a quiet business lounge that Daniel secured with a nod to two men who appeared like shadows at the door. Amara sat at the long table and spread the blue folder before her, though it no longer carried contracts. It carried the memory of what she had endured to build her position. Daniel leaned close as his team opened laptops and pulled data from systems that ordinary people never touched. And soon a map of locations lit up across the screen, dots of surveillance pings, bank card, use apartment logs. Mara whispered her sister's name, Naomi, and the system responded, tracing her last known movement, an apartment complex 30 minutes from the city center, an address Amara knew because she had placed Naomi there under another name with new documents to shield her from people like Marcus. The screen showed Naomi had entered that building 2 days ago, but no exit was logged since. And Amara's chest tightened because Naomi was supposed to check in every morning with a single coded text, and she had missed 2 days. Daniel saw her panic rising and said, "We will not assume the worst until we know." He turned to his men and gave orders. "Move now, get to her apartment, secure the perimeter, extract her if she is there, and bring her to Usta." Men left silently, and the room felt heavier. Amara placed both hands on the table and closed her eyes, breathing through the storm inside her. Daniel watched her, then said, "Tell me about him. Tell me about Marcus, because if I am to protect you, I must know the shape of the enemy." Amara opened her eyes, and her voice trembled with memory, but grew steadier as she spoke. She said, "Marcus was not always like this. He was brilliant. He was magnetic. He had vision that drew people to him. We built companies together from nothing. And when the first collapsed, he told me we would rise again, and we did. But then greed began to poison him. He siphoned money from investors. He manipulated numbers. I confronted him, and he told me he would fix it, but instead he vanished, leaving me to take the blame. I clawed my way back through humiliation and ruin and rebuilt, and I thought I had left him behind. But Marcus does not let go of power he thinks belongs to him." Her eyes darkened. She said, "Now he sees me as the threat, the woman who should have stayed broken and silent, and his answer is to strip me of dignity and family until I am ash. But I am not ash, I am fire." Daniel listened intently, then said, "Fire needs direction, or it burns everything, even what you want to save. We will give you direction." Minutes passed like stones dragging through water, and then Daniel's phone buzzed. He answered, and his face sharpened. He said, "Speak." And then, after a pause, he looked at Amara and said, "They have her. She is alive." But the apartment was already under surveillance. Cameras in the hall hacked locks on the door. Someone has been watching her for days, likely Marcus's people. We extracted her safely, but it means he was preparing to move soon. Amara exhaled relief, mixed with fury. She said, "Bring her here now." And Daniel nodded, but cautioned, "Once she is here, Marcus will know you have defied his threat. He will escalate." She stood tall, her voice steady. "Let him escalate, because I am done living in fear." Moments later, Naomi was brought into the room, her hair tied back, her eyes wide with the shock of being rushed out by men she did not know until she saw Amara and fell into her arms. Sobbing, Amara held her tightly, whispering promises that no harm would touch her again. Naomi said, "They were watching me. I felt it for days, but I stayed quiet because I did not want to worry you." And Amara said, "No more silence, no more hiding." Daniel gave them a moment, but then returned to business. "Marcus is in this terminal still. He has not left, and if he orchestrated this public humiliation, then his plan is not finished. He wants more than your shame. He wants spectacle. He wants the world to see you broken, and that means he will try again." Tonight, Amara pulled back from Naomi and faced Daniel. "Then what do we do? Wait for him to strike?" Daniel shook his head. No, we strike first. They began crafting the counterstrike. Daniel outlined it carefully. Marcus thrived on shadows, so they would drag him into light. Marcus thrived on lies, so they would arm themselves with truth. Amara already had the old documents, evidence of his fraud hidden. In cloud storage, Daniel's men began pulling those files, cross-referencing them with current holdings, tying threads that revealed just how deep Marcus's corruption ran. As the puzzle sharpened, it became clear Marcus had tied himself not only to the airline but to logistics firms, shipping companies, and even offshore accounts that propped up political donors. His empire was broad but fragile. If one piece fell, the rest would tremble. Amara stared at the screen and realized the scale of his power and the scale of the storm she was about to unleash. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Marcus. This time a video. He sat in the VIP lounge, glass of wine in hand, smile sharp as a knife. He said, "Enjoy your little victories, Amara. But remember, every empire falls, and mine will not fall before yours." He raised the glass, and the video ended. Damara's jaw tightened. She said, "He wants me to flinch." Daniel replied, "Then do not flinch." Hit harder. Naomi clutched Amara's hand, fear in her eyes but also belief. She said, "You always told me dignity is worth more than gold. Now show him that." So Amara stood before the table of screens and said, "Then let us burn his empire." Daniel gave orders again, his men moving fast, some to track physical location, others to begin releasing pieces of evidence quietly to journalists who had once been silenced by Marcus's money. The first leak went out within the hour, a small report on financial irregularities tied to one of his shell firms, then another about offshore transfers. Soon the whispers began to ripple across newsrooms while Marcus still sat smug in his lounge, unaware that the ground beneath him was shifting. But Amara knew this was not enough. Marcus would fight back. He would try to trap her again, and she could not wait for it. She had to meet him face to face and end this war. She turned to Daniel and said, "Bring me to him." Daniel hesitated, danger in his eyes, but respect in his tone. He said, "If you go to him, there is no turning back." And she said, "There was never turning back. Not since they mocked me and stamped that paper. Not since he threatened my sister. Not since he betrayed me years ago. It ends now." Naomi gripped her hand, terrified, but Amara kissed her forehead and whispered, "Trust me." They left the lounge, moving through private corridors, security clearing the way, until they reached the doors of the VIP suite, where Marcus waited. The lights inside glowed dim through frosted glass, his laughter faint but distinct. Daniel looked at her once more, asking silently if she was ready, and she nodded, her jaw set, her spirit burning. The doors opened, and there sat Marcus Hale, lounging like a king in exile, his glass raised again, his smile wide until his eyes fell on Amara, and the smile faltered just enough to reveal the truth. He had not expected her to come to him, not so soon, not so strong. Mara stepped inside, her voice like steel. "Marcus, your empire ends tonight." The room stilled, the air thick and heavy, and Marcus laughed again, though this time softer, more forced. He said, "You always did know how to make an entrance, but let us see if you know how to survive the storm that follows." And, as their eyes locked, Amara knew the war was no longer about contracts or humiliation. It was about truth against lies, survival against betrayal, dignity against greed, and only one would walk out with victory. The night had just begun, and the counterstrike was underway. The trap inside the VIP suite, the door closed behind her with a soft hush, but the sound was final, like the seal of a tomb, and Amara felt the air inside the suite, heavy as if the walls themselves carried secrets. Marcus Hale sat sprawled across the from stone. "We must move carefully. This is bait. Marcus wants you to come to him." Reckless, but Amara's voice cracked with fury. "I cannot abandon him. Daniel David stood by me when everyone else turned away. He believed in me when Marcus left me with ashes. If I leave him, Marcus wins without firing a shot." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then we prepare. If you are walking into his trap, we make sure the trap snaps on him instead, not on youth." Hours that followed were spent in ruthless planning. Daniel's men traced the video metadata, tracking its origin to the edges of the industrial district, a warehouse near the docks, a place Marcus had used before to launder shipments into and out of the country, the perfect place for a spectacle away from cameras and crowds. Amara studied the maps spread across the table, every exit, every shadow, every wall. Daniel outlined the plan his team would infiltrate. First disable external guards. She would enter only when the path was secure. But Amara shook her head, her voice steady but fierce. No, Marcus wants me. He will not reveal himself unless I walk into the lion's den. And Daniel countered, you walk in, but you do not walk in alone. I will be with you. Naomi gripped her sister's hand, tears glistening in her eyes. Don't go. Don't walk into him, please. But Amara held her gaze and whispered, this is the only way. He has taken everything from me once. Naomi, I will not let him do it again. When night fell again, they moved the city lights, reflecting off dark waters as black vans rolled toward the docks. Daniel's men moved like ghosts, slipping through alleys, silencing lookouts until the perimeter was clear. Amara and Daniel approached the warehouse, its steel doors looming heavy, the sound of waves crashing faint against the silence of night. Inside, the air was damp thick with the smell of oil and rust. Shadows stretched long under flickering lights, and at the center of the floor David sat bound to the chair, his head drooped, blood dried on his temple. Amara's breath hitched, but she forced herself forward, her heels clicking sharp on concrete, her voice slicing the silence. Marcus, show yourself. Clapping echoed slow, deliberate. Marcus emerged from the shadows, flanked by men, armed and silent, his suit immaculate, his smile confident. Though his empire bled outside these walls, he said, bravo. Amara, you came just as I knew you would. Predictable, righteous, foolish. Mara stood firm, every nerve screaming, but her eyes unblinking. Release him. Marcus, this is between you and me. Marcus chuckled. No, Amara, this has never been between you and me alone. This has always been about control. The world bends for those who take it. You build with honesty. I build with fear, and fear always wins. Daniel shifted beside her, his gun steady, his presence like stone. Marcus's eyes flicked to him, and he sneered, ah, the loyal guard dog. You think one gun tips the scales? In a room full of men, Amara raised her chin, her voice steady. Truth tips scales. Marcus' lies rot from within, and tonight, your lies are collapsing even as you speak. Marcus's smile faltered only briefly, but he masked it with a laugh. You think leaks and headlines matter? By tomorrow they will forget. People always forget. People always forget. Amara took a step closer, her voice low but cutting. Not this time, because I will not let them forget. I will carve your name into history, not as power but as shame, and that cannot be. Buried. Marcus's jaw clenched. He snapped his fingers. His men stepped forward, weapons raised. Daniel moved in front of Amara, gun drawn, tension exploding through the room. Marcus growled, last chance. Amara, walk away from this war. Walk away from me, or I will spill his blood. No. David lifted his head weakly, his eyes meeting Amara's, pleading without words. She shook her head, tears burning her eyes. No more running, no more silence. If it ends here, then let it end with truth, not fear and then chaos. Daniel fired first, dropping one of Marcus's men. Gunfire erupted across the warehouse, bullets striking metal, sending sparks into shadows. Amara ducked behind a crate, heart pounding. Daniel's men stormed in from hidden entrances, guns blazing. Marcus shouted orders, fury in his voice. The trap had sprung, but not in his favor. Amara crawled toward David, dodging flying shards until she reached him. She ripped at the ropes, her fingers raw, finally breaking him free. He collapsed into her arms, but managed to rasp. Thank you, she whispered. Hold on, we are not done yet. Marcus realized the battle was slipping, his men falling one by one too. Daniel's trained operatives, he snarled, grabbing a pistol himself, striding forward toward Amara, his eyes wild. If I cannot break you, I will kill you myself. Farmer arose, shielding David behind her. Marcus aimed, but before he could fire, Daniel struck from the side, tackling him to the ground. The gun skittered across the concrete. Marcus fought viciously, teeth-bared fists, swinging. Daniel met him blow for blow until they rolled in a brutal struggle. Marcus, snarling like an animal. Amara seized the gun, sliding across the floor. She pointed it at Marcus, her hands shaking. Daniel pinned him long enough for her to aim. Marcus froze, breath heaving, sweat and rage dripping. He spat. You will not do it. You do not have the strength. You build. You do not destroy. Amara's eyes burned with fire, her voice steady, stronger than she felt. You are wrong, Marcus. I destroy what destroys others, and tonight that is you. She pulled the trigger. The shot cracked like thunder. Marcus cried out, clutching his shoulder. The bullet tearing through flesh but not ending him. He collapsed to the floor, writhing, rage and shock in his eyes. Daniel pulled her back, his voice urgent enough. He is finished. Let him face the world's judgment, not just a bullet. Amara lowered the gun, her body trembling but her will unbroken. Marcus glared up at her, his face twisted with hate. "This is not over. I will rise again. You cannot erase me." She knelt down, her face inches from his, her voice a whisper of steel. "You are already erased." Daniel's men secured him, handcuffs clinking loud in the silent aftermath. David was carried out weak but alive. Amara walked into the night air, the first hints of dawn breaking again across the docks, her body exhausted but her soul burning with a fire unextinguished. Naomi ran to her arms, tears streaming. Amara held her close, whispering, "It is over. He cannot touch you now." But inside, she knew it was not yet fully over. Marcus was captured, his empire crumbling, but enemies like him never vanished. Quietly they left echoes, shadows, claws that reached from the dark to strike again. Yet Amara was no longer the woman mocked in the lounge. Humiliated and alone, she was fire, she was justice, she was the storm that Marcus Hale had never seen coming. And the final reckoning was still ahead. The final reckoning. The warehouse echoed with the sound of sirens approaching in the distance, blue and red lights reflecting faintly across the metal beams. The night was giving way to morning, but the tension in the air was not easing. Marcus Hale lay cuffed on the floor, his face pale with rage, his shoulder bleeding where Amara's bullet had cut through him, yet his eyes still burned with hatred. He looked at her as if, even in defeat, he could still break her. Amara stood over him, her chest rising and falling heavy, but her gaze steady, unshaken. Daniel beside her, his gun lowered but his guard never dropping. Naomi clung to Amara's arm, trembling though safe. David, weak but alive, watched with tears in his eyes. Police stormed the warehouse, their shouts filling the air as they took custody of Marcus, their hands rough but controlled. Dragging him upright, he stumbled but still managed to laugh, the sound hollow and cruel. He spat words at Amara as they pulled him away. "This is not the end. You think the world will side with you. You think they want your justice. No, they want my power. I will walk free, and when I do, I will come for you." Amara did not flinch. She stepped forward close enough that her voice cut through his venom like ice. She whispered, "No, Marcus, you will not walk free, because I am not finished with you yet." He was dragged out into the flashing lights, the weight of years pressed against Amara, memories of betrayal, humiliation, collapse, but also of survival, of clawing her way back when the world counted her out. She looked at Naomi, whose eyes shone with pride and fear. She looked at David, whose bruised face carried gratitude. She looked at Daniel, whose steady presence had stood beside her through fire, and she knew this was not just her fight anymore. It was theirs, and it was bigger than Marcus. Back in the secure lounge, hours later, Amara sat at the table, papers spread before her, evidence files. Photographs, accounts, every thread of Marcus's empire. Her phone buzzed endlessly, journalists demanding statements, allies offering cautious support, enemies retreating into silence. Daniel's men reported Marcus was in custody, but already lawyers were moving, already politicians were whispering. Marcus's allies trying to spin the story. Ara listened, then rose, her voice sharp with purpose. "Enough silence. We do not wait for his allies to bury the truth. We bury him ourselves." She spread the files across the table and began dictating one by one. Every piece of evidence, every connection, every bribe. Daniel's team moved fast, sending them 2 trusted journalists, releasing videos of Marcus's confessions, recorded in the chaos of the warehouse, showing his arrogance, his admissions, his cruelty. The story spread like fire, headlines screaming across the world. Marcus Hale exposed, but Amara knew headlines were not enough. Marcus had built himself into more than a man. He was a network, a shadow empire, one that thrived on fear. She had to burn not just the man, but the myth. So she went public herself, standing before cameras, her voice steady but full of fire. She said, "The world has seen the face of arrogance, the face of betrayal. Marcus Hale believed power belonged to those who could crush others into silence. He believed dignity could be denied at a boarding gate. He believed families could be threatened for profit. Today I stand before you to say he was wrong. Dignity is not given by men like him. It is claimed by those who refuse to bow." The words cut across screens, into homes, into boardrooms, into hearts. People who had once stayed silent spoke up. Workers he had exploited shared their stories. Politicians who had once taken his money now fled from his shadow. The tide turned heavy and unstoppable. Marcus tried to fight from his cell, releasing statements through his lawyers claiming conspiracy, blaming Amara, smearing her name, but every word was drowned by the evidence. Every denial countered by facts, every lie met with truth, until even his allies could not hold on his empire. Fractured piece by piece, crumbling, Into dust days passed, then weeks. Amara barely slept, but her fire did not fade. Naomi at her side. David recovering. Daniel constant. She attended hearings, watched as Marcus was brought in, stripped of his arrogance, his once perfect suits replaced by prison clothes, his smirk now a mask that cracked under the weight of truth. She testified with strength, her voice unshaken, recounting the humiliation, the threats, the betrayals. She laid bare his empire of shadows until the court was flooded with light. When the verdict came, the world held its breath, guilty on every count: fraud, corruption, conspiracy, kidnapping, abuse of power. The list long, the sentence severe. Marcus Hale, once untouchable, once feared, was dragged away, a broken man screaming that he would rise again, but no one believed him anymore. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, the crowd roared. Amara stood tall, Naomi clutching her hand, David by her side, Daniel watching quietly. She raised her chin and spoke once more to the world. She said, "Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find who you really are. They mocked me. They tried to strip me of dignity, but dignity cannot be stolen. It lives here in every one of us who refuses to kneel to cruelty. I stand not for revenge, but for truth, for justice, and for the promise that no one should ever be told they do not belong." The crowd erupted. The story carried across nations. Amara became not just a survivor, not just a fighter, but a symbol. She had faced betrayal, humiliation, danger, and still she had risen. Fire forged from pain. That night, she sat with Naomi on the balcony of their home, the city lights glittering. Naomi rested her head against her sister's shoulder and whispered, "You did it." Amara smiled softly. "No, Naomi, we did it together." Naomi asked quietly, "What happens now?" And Amara looked at the stars, her voice calm. "Now we rebuild, but this time, we build not just for us, we build for everyone." He tried to silence Daniel, joined them quietly, setting down papers, contracts, new opportunities, but this time aligned with dignity codes. Amara's vision had inspired companies to sign not just for profit, but for principle. She looked at him, gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you, Daniel, for standing with me." He shook his head. "No, Amara, thank you for teaching me what real strength looks like." The night air was cool, but within her chest was warmth at last. Peace, not complete, but beginning. Marcus Hale's name would fade into history, not as power, but as a warning, a lesson carved in shame. And Amara's name would rise, not because she sought glory, but because she refused silence. Her journey from humiliation to justice was complete. She had been mocked, she had been betrayed, she had been threatened, but she had answered with fire, with dignity, with truth, and the world had listened. Down as Naomi fell asleep against her shoulder, Amara whispered to herself, "Sometimes the only way to survive betrayal is to turn it into the fire that builds a new world." And tonight that fire burned bright. The end.